The human sees the unseen. The city was quiet at night. The tall buildings stood like dark giants, and the streets were empty except for a few blinking lights. The air smelled of metal and rain, and somewhere in the distance, a drone hummed as it scanned the streets. David Carter, a young security officer, walked along the sidewalk, his boots making soft sounds against the concrete. He had worked this night shift for 2 years now. It was always the same, boring, quiet, and lonely. But tonight, something felt different. David stopped near an alley. His sharp eyes noticed something strange. For a moment, the air in front of him rippled, like a drop of water spreading in a pond. It was quick, so quick that most people would ignore it. But David's instincts were sharp. He knew what he saw. His heart beat faster. He took a step closer. Nothing. The alley was dark, filled with old trash bins and broken pipes. A streetlight flickered above, casting weak shadows. David frowned. Maybe he was imagining things. Maybe he was just tired. Then he saw it again. A soft shimmer in the air, like heat waves rising from the ground. But it was cold tonight, too cold for heat waves. David's breath slowed. His hand moved to the flashlight on his belt. He raised it and shone the light into the alley. For a split second, the beam caught something. A shape. A figure. Someone was standing there. David's grip tightened around the flashlight. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice firm. No answer. He took a slow step forward. The figure moved, or at least it looked like movement, but it was strange. It was not like a normal person walking. It was silent, almost like a shadow shifting in the wind. David's pulse quickened. He had seen criminals before. He had chased thieves, broken up street fights, even faced a few armed men. But this was different. He felt it. Whoever, or whatever, was in that alley was not normal. He swallowed hard. "I know you're there," he said. "Come out." For a moment, nothing happened. The silence stretched, long and heavy. Then, a soft gasp. David's eyes widened. It was a girl's voice. His flashlight flickered as the battery struggled. The streetlight above buzzed loudly, then suddenly died. The alley became even darker. David stepped back, alert. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said carefully. "Just show yourself." More silence. Then the air shifted again. The shimmer grew stronger. And then she appeared. A girl, standing right in front of him. She had silver hair, glowing faintly under the weak light. Her eyes were violet, deep and full of fear. Her skin. No, not just her skin. Her whole body seemed to shift, blending into the surroundings like a chameleon. David froze. His mind struggled to understand what he was looking at. This wasn't human. The girl stepped back, her violet eyes wide. You can see me," she whispered. David didn't answer. His brain was still trying to catch up. She spoke English. She looked young, maybe 17 or 18. Her clothes were strange, tight, flexible, like a second skin. She had no shoes, and her fingers were longer than normal. But the strangest part, she was flickering, as if her body couldn't decide if it wanted to be visible or invisible. David exhaled slowly. He had seen many things in his life. But this was impossible. The girl looked terrified. She took another step back. "You're not supposed to see me," she whispered. David found his voice. "Well, I do." She shook her head. "That's not possible." David narrowed his eyes. "What are you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she looked around, as if checking for something, or someone. That's when David heard it, a sharp metallic sound from behind. He turned his head slightly. A drone had appeared at the entrance of the alley. Its red sensor light flickered, scanning the area. David's stomach dropped. That was not a normal city drone. The girl tensed. David looked at her. She looked at him. Then she ran. David had a choice. He could let her go and pretend he never saw anything. Or he could follow her. The air was thick with tension. The drone made a loud beeping sound, and David knew he had seconds to decide. Without thinking, he made his choice. He ran after her. The girl no one was supposed to see. David ran. The alley was dark, the shadows deep, but he didn't stop. His boots hit the ground hard, his breath sharp in his chest. The girl moved fast, almost unnaturally fast. 1 second she was there. The next, she flickered, her body blending into the walls like a ghost. But David could still see her. That was the strangest part. His legs burned as he chased her through the narrow alley, dodging trash bins and broken pipes. The girl looked back once, her violet eyes wide with fear. She wasn't just running. She was running for her life. The drone behind them beeped loudly. A red scanning light swept across the alley, searching, locking onto the movement. David had no idea what was happening, but he knew one thing. If that drone caught her, it wouldn't end well. The girl suddenly leaped forward. Her body shimmered, twisted, and she disappeared. David skidded to a stop. His heart pounded. Gone. Vanished, like she was never there. David's eyes darted around. No footprints. No sound. Just empty darkness. The drone hovered closer, scanning the area. David pressed his back against the wall, his breath slow, controlled. It whirred, its red light flashing. It was searching. And then, David felt it. A presence. Something was right beside him. His skin tingled. His instincts screamed at him. But when he turned his head, there was nothing. And yet, he knew. David exhaled softly and whispered, "I know you're here." Silence. The drone beeped again, its lights sweeping across the alley. Then, a hand gripped David's wrist. Cold, small, trembling. David didn't react. He just whispered, "Are they looking for you?" The grip tightened. Yes, it was her, the invisible girl. She was right next to him. David felt his heartbeat slow. He had so many questions. Who was she? Why was she hiding? Why could he see her? But this wasn't the time. The drone let out a louder beep. The red light passed over them. David didn't breathe. The girl's hand tightened around his wrist, and suddenly, the air around them rippled. David felt strange, like the world was bending around him. And then, his body vanished. Or at least, it felt like it. The drone's red light flickered over them again. And this time, it passed right over them. David wanted to speak, wanted to ask what was happening, but his body refused to move. He felt weightless, like he wasn't entirely real anymore. The girl's voice was barely a whisper. "Stay still." David obeyed. The drone scanned the alley once more, then, with a final beep, it flew away. The moment it disappeared, the air around David shifted, his vision blurred, and suddenly, he could see himself again. He looked down at his hands, his legs, his body. Solid again. Visible. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. The girl let go of his wrist and took a shaky step back. Now that she wasn't running, David could see her clearly. She was young, maybe 17 or 18. Her silver hair looked almost metallic under the dim streetlights, her skin still flickering slightly. Her body was tense, her breathing uneven. She looked at David, her violet eyes filled with confusion and fear. You saw me," she said, "even when I was hidden." David nodded slowly. "Yeah. That's not possible." "Well, it just happened." The girl took another step back. She was still on edge, ready to run again. David raised his hand slowly. "Look, I don't know what's going on, but I'm not going to hurt you." She didn't answer. David took a slow breath. "Who are you?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Zyra." Zyra. It didn't sound like an Earth name. David studied her carefully. The way her body flickered, the way her eyes glowed faintly in the dark, The way she had made him invisible, she wasn't human. That much was obvious. Zira, he said slowly, testing the name. What are you? She tensed. You wouldn't believe me. David almost laughed. I just watched you disappear. I'll believe anything at this point. Zira looked down, her hands curling into fists. She looked like she was debating something. Then, finally, she spoke. I'm not from here. David's heart skipped a beat. Not from here. He already knew what that meant. But hearing her say it made it real. You're an alien, he said. Zira's violet eyes flickered. She nodded. David exhaled. He had just met an actual alien. A living, breathing, intelligent being that wasn't human. His world suddenly felt a lot bigger. But before he could say anything else, a loud sound echoed from the other end of the alley. Footsteps. Not human ones. Zira gasped and grabbed David's arm. They found me. David turned his head. Dark figures were moving toward them. Not drones this time. Something else. Zira looked at David, her face pale with fear. If they catch me, I'm dead. David clenched his jaw. He had a choice. He could walk away, pretend he never saw any of this. Or he could help her. Zira's hands trembled. She was terrified. David exhaled and made his decision. Come on, he said. I'm not letting them take you. He grabbed her wrist and ran. A dangerous secret. David ran. The night was cold, but sweat trickled down his back as he sprinted through the dark streets, dragging Zira behind him. Her grip was tight, too tight. She was afraid, terrified. The city was mostly asleep, but the lights above cast long shadows as they moved. David could hear the footsteps behind them, heavy, fast, and inhuman. Whoever was chasing them was closing in. Zira's breathing was ragged. They're not far, she gasped. David's mind raced. He didn't know who they were, but he didn't need to. If Zira was scared, that meant these people, or things, were bad news. He turned sharply into a narrow alley. Trash bags and rusted metal covered the ground. The smell was awful, but David didn't care. He had to get them off the street. In here, he whispered, pulling Zira behind an old dumpster. She pressed against the wall, still flickering slightly. Her body was trying to turn invisible, but she was too exhausted. David peeked out. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. David's pulse pounded in his ears. Had they lost them? Then, a soft clicking sound. Metal against concrete. David's stomach dropped. Something was out there. Slowly, carefully, he leaned out just enough to see. 3 figures stood at the alley entrance. They were tall, at least 6.5 feet, their bodies covered in dark armor that seemed to blend with the night. Their faces were hidden behind smooth, featureless masks, except for 2 glowing slits where their eyes should be. David had seen a lot of things working in security, but these weren't human. They moved in perfect sync, their heads tilting at the same time, scanning the area. One of them lifted a small device. A low hum filled the air. Zira stiffened beside him. "Oh no," she whispered. "It's a scanner." David didn't know what that meant, but it didn't sound good. The hum grew louder. Zira grabbed his hand. David felt the world shift again. The air around them rippled, and suddenly his body started to disappear. But before they could fully vanish, the scanner let out a loud, piercing beep. The 3 figures snapped their heads toward the dumpster. David's heart stopped. "They found us," Zira whispered. The lead figure lunged. David barely had time to react. He yanked Zira's arm and ran. The alley exploded with movement. The figures chased them with inhuman speed, their boots slamming against the ground. David shoved past broken crates, dodged pipes, barely keeping ahead. Zira's hand trembled in his grip. "We won't outrun them." David cursed under his breath. She was right. Then he spotted it. At the end of the alley, an old service tunnel leading into an abandoned subway station. It was small, rusted shut, but it was their only chance. David sprinted toward it. The metal door loomed closer. One of the figures raised a weapon, a sleek, black rifle that didn't look human. A bolt of blue energy shot past David's head. He ducked. The wall behind him exploded, sending sparks flying. David reached the tunnel. He slammed his shoulder into the door. Nothing. It didn't budge. The figures were almost on them. David hit the door again, harder. It groaned, but still didn't open. The lead figure raised its weapon for another shot. Zira suddenly threw her hands forward. A strange pulse of light exploded from her fingertips. Not bright, but strong. The air around them rippled, and for a split second, David felt his body pull forward as if gravity had shifted. The door swung open. David didn't question it. He grabbed Zira and dived inside. The moment they were through, the door slammed shut behind them. Darkness. David rolled onto his back, gasping for breath. His heart was pounding. Zira collapsed beside him, her body shaking. Outside, the figures stopped. David listened, holding his breath. Then, one of them spoke. A low, distorted voice. "She's weakening." The second one responded. "She can't hide forever." Silence. Then the footsteps faded away. David exhaled. For now, they were safe. The truth comes out. David turned to Zira. She looked pale, exhausted. "Who the hell are they?" he asked. Zira wiped sweat from her forehead. "Hunters," she whispered. "They're tracking me." David frowned. "Why?" She hesitated. David sat up. "Zira, I just risked my life for you. I think I deserve some answers." She looked at him, her violet eyes filled with guilt. Then, finally, she spoke. "My people, they have a law. We are not allowed to leave our planet." David frowned. "So, you ran away?" Zira shook her head. "No, I escaped." David's breath caught. Escaped from what? Zira's voice was barely a whisper. "An experiment." David's stomach turned cold. What kind of experiment? She looked down. Her hands trembled. "They were changing us, making us stronger." She swallowed hard. "I was one of the first, and when I realized what they were doing, I ran." David stared at her. Now it made sense. The invisibility, the fear, the hunters. She wasn't just any alien. She was an experiment that wasn't supposed to exist. David leaned back against the cold wall. His mind was spinning. Zira looked at him with pleading eyes. "I don't want to go back, David." Her voice cracked. "If they take me back, I'll never be free again." David exhaled slowly. He didn't know her. He didn't know if she was telling the whole truth. But one thing was clear. She needed help. And now, because of his choice, he was in this too. David clenched his jaw. "Then we won't let them take you." Zira's lips parted slightly. "You mean, you'll help me?" David nodded. "Yeah." He pulled himself up, offering her a hand. "But first, we need to figure out how to get you off this planet." Zira stared at him. Then, for the first time, she smiled. The chase begins. David stood in the cold, damp tunnel, his mind racing. His life had changed in a single night. A few hours ago, he had been a simple security officer. Now he was hiding an alien fugitive from hunters who were clearly ready to kill. He looked at Zira. She was sitting on the ground, leaning against the wall, breathing heavily. Her silver hair was damp with sweat, and her violet eyes were distant, unfocused. "You okay?" he asked. She shook her head slightly. "I used too much energy." David didn't understand everything about her abilities, but he could see that she was weak, and if those hunters came back now, she wouldn't stand a chance. "We can't stay here," he said. Zira nodded but didn't move. David frowned. "Come on, we have to go. I just need a minute." David sighed and knelt beside her. You said those hunters are from your world. Why are they after you? Zira hesitated, then looked up at him. Because I'm not supposed to exist. David's stomach tightened. She continued, her voice barely a whisper. My people, they created me. I was part of a test. They wanted to see if we could become something more, faster, stronger, more evolved. David stared at her, an experiment. Zira nodded. I was the first, and when I realized what they were doing, turning us into weapons, I ran. David exhaled. And now, they want to take you back. They have to, she said bitterly. If I stay free, it means their experiment failed, and they can't let that happen. David clenched his jaw. It was clear now. These weren't just bounty hunters. This was a cover-up. If they caught Zira, she wouldn't be taken home. She would be erased. He took a deep breath. All right. We need to get you off this planet. Zira blinked at him. What? You need to leave Earth. If you stay, they'll keep coming. Zira laughed weakly. And how do you expect to do that? You think I can just book a ticket on a spaceship? David smirked. Not exactly. Zira raised an eyebrow. Then what's the plan? David looked toward the tunnel entrance. I know someone. A guy who deals with off-the-books transport. If anyone can get you off-world, it's him. Zira's eyes narrowed. And you trust him? David hesitated. Not really. But he's our best option. Zira sighed. Fine. Where do we find him? David stood up and offered her a hand. First, we need to get out of here. Zira took his hand, and they moved deeper into the tunnels. The hunters close in. The underground passage was dark, the air thick with dust and decay. David's flashlight flickered as they walked. Zira's breathing was still uneven, but she was pushing forward. Then, David heard it, a faint beeping sound. He stopped. Did you hear that? Zira froze. Yes. The beeping grew louder. David's stomach twisted. Something was tracking them. Zira's face turned pale. They tagged me. David turned to her. What? When we were running. They must have hit me with a tracker. That's how they're following us. David cursed. Can you remove it? She shook her head. If I knew where it was. David gritted his teeth. They needed to move. Fast. They sprinted through the tunnel, their footsteps echoing in the darkness. Then, a red light appeared ahead of them. David stopped cold. It was a drone, the same type as before. Only this time, it wasn't alone. Behind the drone, stepping out of the shadows, were two hunters. Zira gripped David's arm. We're trapped. The lead hunter tilted its head. Its mask glowed red. Target acquired. David had seconds to react. Then the shooting started. Fight or die. David shoved Zira behind a concrete pillar as blue energy bolts flew past them. He peeked around the corner. The hunters were advancing fast. We have to get out of here, Zira shouted. David's mind raced. There was only one way out, past the hunters. Then he spotted something. An old electrical panel on the wall. If it still worked. David grabbed a rusted metal pipe from the ground. Stay here, he told Zira. Before she could argue, he ran. The hunters turned their weapons toward him. David swung the pipe, hard, against the electrical panel. Sparks exploded. The entire tunnel went dark. Escape into the night. In the pitch black, David felt a hand grab his. It was Zira. Come on, she whispered. They ran. The hunters fired blindly into the darkness, but David and Zira were already gone, disappearing into another tunnel exit. When they finally surfaced, they were in an abandoned train station. David collapsed onto the ground, breathing hard. Zira sat beside him, shaking. That was close, she murmured. David let out a breathless laugh. Yeah, too close. Zira looked at him. Your friend. The one who can get me off-world. Where is he? David sat up. He had only one answer. Black Market District. Zira frowned. That sounds bad. David smirked. That's because it is. Trust and betrayal. David and Zira stood at the entrance of the Black Market District, a part of the city that most people pretended didn't exist. It was a place of secrets, hidden deals, and illegal trade. Anything could be bought here, for a price. Zira pulled her hood lower, hiding her silver hair. Her skin was still flickering slightly, but she was doing her best to stay solid. David glanced at her. You good? She nodded, but her hands trembled slightly. I don't like this place. David smirked. Yeah, well, neither do I. The Black Market District was a maze of dark alleys, neon-lit signs, and whispering traders. People here didn't ask questions. They only cared about money, power, or survival. David led Zira through the narrow streets, past vendors selling stolen technology, fake IDs, and alien artifacts. The air smelled of smoke and oil, and every few steps, a new set of eyes watched them. Zira leaned closer. Who exactly are we looking for? David kept walking. A guy named Rogan. He smuggles people off-world. Zira frowned. And you trust him? David let out a dry laugh. Not even a little. But he's our best shot. Zira sighed. Great. They turned a corner and reached a rusted metal door with a flickering sign above it that read, Rogan's Repairs. David knocked twice. Silence. Then, a small mechanical eye slid open on the door, scanning them. A rough voice came from inside. Go away. David rolled his eyes. Rogan, it's me. A pause. Then, a series of locks clicked open. The door swung inward, and a large man with cybernetic arms and a scared face appeared. He squinted at David. Well, Rogan muttered. Didn't expect to see you again, Carter. David smirked. Miss me? Rogan snorted. Not really. What do you want? David stepped inside, pulling Zira with him. Rogan's shop was cluttered with half-built machines, stolen alien tech, and flickering monitors. The smell of burnt wires filled the air. David got straight to the point. We need a way off-world. Fast. Rogan raised an eyebrow. Off-world, huh? His gaze flicked to Zira, who shifted uncomfortably under his stare. Rogan's smirk faded. What the hell is she? David folded his arms. None of your business. Can you get us a ship or not? Rogan rubbed his chin. Depends. You got money. David hesitated. Not much. Rogan sighed. Then it's gonna cost you, in another way. David's stomach tightened. He knew that tone. Rogan leaned against the table. There's a shipment coming in tonight. Illegal cargo. The people who own it owe me money, but they're refusing to pay. David groaned. You want me to steal it? Rogan grinned. Smart boy. Zira looked at David, alarmed. This wasn't part of the plan. David sighed. It never is. A risky job. The job was simple, on paper. Break into a warehouse. Steal a small data chip from a locked container. Get out. David and Zira crouched behind a loading dock, watching the warehouse from the shadows. A few guards paced nearby, carrying stun rifles. Zira whispered, Are you sure about this? David smirked. Nope. She rolled her eyes. Great. They moved fast. Zira used her flickering invisibility to slip past the first set of guards, deactivating security cameras as she went. David followed behind, sticking to the shadows. They reached the storage room. The metal container was locked with a high-tech fingerprint scanner. David sighed. Figures. Zira smirked. Let me try something. She placed her hand against the scanner. For a second, her skin shifted, changing color, mimicking the fingerprints stored in the system. David stared. You can do that. Zira grinned. I told you. I'm different. The lock clicked open. David grabbed the data chip and slipped it into his pocket. Then, the alarms started blaring. Zira cursed. "You triggered something." David groaned. "Not my fault." Footsteps rushed toward them. They were trapped. David grabbed Zira's hand. "Time to go." They sprinted through the warehouse as guards shouted behind them. Zira suddenly threw her hands forward, and the air shimmered. For a brief moment, the two of them vanished. The guards rushed past, confused. When they were clear, Zira let go of the ability, gasping, "I can't. Keep doing that." David pulled her forward, just a little more. They reached the exit, slipping out into the night. The moment they were safe, David exhaled. That was too close. Zira glared at him. "We almost died." David grinned. "But we didn't." She rolled her eyes. "I hate you." David smirked. "No, you don't." The betrayal. They returned to Rogan's shop, handing over the stolen chip. Rogan grinned. "Nice work." David crossed his arms. "Now, about that ship." Rogan nodded. "Yeah, about that." Then, something cold pressed against David's back. A gun. David stiffened. He turned slowly. One of Rogan's men had a weapon pointed at his spine. Zira tensed, stepping back. "What's this?" Rogan sighed. "You didn't think I'd actually help you, did you?" David's fists clenched. "You son of a..." Rogan smirked. "See, I don't mind getting people off-world. But your friend, she's worth a lot of money." Zira's face paled. David's blood turned cold. Rogan looked at her. "The bounty on you. Let's just say, I'll be rich." David lunged. He knocked the gun aside just as Zira vanished. Rogan cursed. "Find her." David elbowed the guard in the face, grabbing his weapon. Chaos erupted. Gunfire, shouting, flashing lights. David ducked behind a metal crate. Zira was nowhere to be seen. And Rogan had called for backup. David was outnumbered. And if Zira didn't come back, he was dead. The final stand. David hit the ground hard. His ribs burned as he rolled behind a metal crate, dodging another burst of gunfire. The black market district was alive with chaos. Alarms blared, lights flickered, and the sharp smell of burning wires filled the air. Rogan had betrayed them. Now his men were closing in. David's grip tightened around the stolen weapon he had wrestled from one of Rogan's thugs. He peeked out. 5 men were advancing, guns raised. But Zira was nowhere to be seen. David's heart pounded. Had she run? Had she left him behind? He shook the thought away. No time for doubt. He had 2 options, fight or die. The fight begins. David took a deep breath and moved. He rolled out of cover, fired twice. 2 men dropped. The others reacted fast, returning fire. David ducked, sliding behind an old workbench. Sparks rained down as bullets tore into the walls. His mind raced. He was outnumbered. No way he could win this alone. He needed a distraction. His eyes flicked to the ceiling. An old fuel pipe ran along the wall. Perfect. David aimed his gun and fired. The pipe ruptured, spilling thick, black smoke into the air. The room filled with confusion. David seized his chance, leaping over the workbench and knocking a thug unconscious with the butt of his gun. 3 down. 2 left. But before he could move, a hand grabbed him from behind. David struggled, twisting as he was slammed against the wall. Rogan stood there, smirking. "You should have known better, Carter," Rogan said, pressing a knife against David's throat. "You never trust a guy like me." David gritted his teeth. "I figured." Rogan chuckled. "Then why'd you walk into my shop?" David smirked. "Because I needed a way out." Rogan frowned. David glanced past his shoulder, right as the air rippled. Zira returns. Before Rogan could react, Zira appeared behind him, silent as a ghost. Her violet eyes blazed with anger. Rogan had 1 second to realize what was happening. Then Zyra placed her hand on his shoulder, and the air shimmered. Rogan's body flickered, distorted, his entire form twisted like static on a broken screen. He screamed. Zyra let go, and Rogan collapsed, gasping. His hands trembled, his face pale. David grabbed his gun and aimed it at Rogan's head. "You made a mistake," David said, breathing hard. Rogan coughed, his voice shaking. What did she do to me?" Zyra's expression was cold. "You don't want to find out." The remaining guards hesitated, seeing Rogan on the ground. David smirked. "You might want to tell your guys to stand down." Rogan gritted his teeth, but he knew when he was beaten. He raised a shaky hand. "Stand down," he growled. His men lowered their weapons. David turned to Zyra. "You came back." She rolled her eyes. "Of course I did. I need you, remember?" David chuckled. "Touching." Zyra smirked. "Don't get used to it." The great escape. They didn't have time to celebrate. Zyra grabbed David's arm. "We need to go. Now." They rushed out of the warehouse, past Rogan's men, who didn't dare move. Outside, the streets were eerily empty. That's when David realized something was wrong. Zyra froze. Then she whispered, "They're here." David followed her gaze. Down the street, stepping out of the shadows, were the hunters. Not just 2 this time. 5 of them. Their black armor glistened under the streetlights. Their weapons hummed with deadly energy. The lead hunter tilted its head. "You cannot run," it said, its voice cold and mechanical. David exhaled. Not again. Then the hunters raised their weapons. The final stand. David grabbed Zyra's wrist. "Go." They sprinted down the alley as blasts of energy erupted behind them. Walls exploded, sending debris flying. Zyra was fast, but she was still weak. She stumbled. David caught her, pulling her forward. A hunter dropped from above, landing right in front of them. David skidded to a stop, raising his gun. The hunter swung its arm. Fast. David barely dodged, but the force of the attack threw him backward. Pain exploded in his ribs. He tried to get up, but the hunter's foot pressed down on his chest. David gasped for air. The lead hunter stepped forward, aiming a weapon at Zyra. "Target acquired," it said. "Mission complete." Zyra's hands trembled. "No." David struggled, desperate to move. He had failed. They had won. The unexpected twist. Then, something changed. Zyra took a deep breath, and suddenly, her body began to glow. The hunters hesitated. The air shimmered violently around her. Then, a shockwave exploded outward. David was thrown back as the force knocked everyone off their feet. For a split second, the world distorted. The hunters staggered, their armor flickering. Their weapons short-circuited. Zyra's voice was strong, powerful. "I will never go back." The hunters struggled to rise. David didn't wait. He grabbed Zyra's hand. "Now's our chance." They ran. This time, the hunters didn't follow. Zyra's power had done something. David didn't know what. But they weren't sticking around to find out. The final step. An hour later, they'd reached the outskirts of the city. A ship was waiting, a stolen freighter from one of Rogan's contacts. David handed the pilot a data chip, their last payment for the ride. The engines roared to life. Zyra looked at David. "This is it." David smirked. "You ready?" Zyra hesitated. Then she smiled. "Yeah." The ship lifted off, leaving the planet behind. For the first time, Zyra was truly free. David sat back, exhaling. "I can't believe we pulled that off." Zyra grinned. "You did good, human." David chuckled. "You're stuck with me now." Zyra smirked. "I guess I am." The stars stretched before them, and their journey was only beginning. The human who changed everything. The ship shook as it broke through the planet's atmosphere, rattling from the force of gravity pulling against it. David sat in the co-pilot's seat, gripping the armrests. Across from him, Zara was staring out the window, watching her first sunrise from space. She was silent. For the first time since he met her, she didn't look afraid. The vast expanse of stars stretched out before them, infinite and free. David exhaled, shaking his head. I can't believe we made it. Zara turned to him. Her violet eyes glowed faintly in the dim light of the cockpit. Neither can I. She smiled. A small, real smile. David smirked. You almost sound happy. Zara rolled her eyes. Almost. The pilot, an old gruff smuggler named Jex, leaned back in his chair, kicking his boots up on the console. All right, kids, he muttered. I got you off-world. Now what? David frowned. That was a good question. Where did they go from here? Nowhere left to run. Zara's expression darkened. David noticed the shift immediately. You okay? He asked. Zara looked away. I don't know. She had spent her whole life running from experiments, from her creators, from death. But now, she was free. For the first time ever. And it terrified her. David leaned back, watching the starry void outside the ship. Where do you want to go? He asked. Zara hesitated. I don't know. She had never been given a choice before. She had nowhere. David studied her for a moment, then made a decision. You're coming with me. Zara blinked, confused. What? David smirked. Look, you don't have a plan. You don't know where to go. And I don't exactly have a home anymore either. Zara frowned. Because of me. David shrugged. Yeah, but I'm not mad about it. She stared at him, searching his face for any sign of a lie. But David was serious. You and me, he said. We make a good team. Zara's lips pressed together. You don't even know me. David chuckled. I know enough. And let's be honest, you're not gonna survive out here alone. Zara narrowed her eyes. Are you saying I'm weak? David smirked. No, I'm saying you suck at making plans. Zara glared. But after a second, she sighed. Fine, she muttered. I guess I could use some help. David grinned. That's the spirit. Jex groaned. Great. More strays. David ignored him. Where's the nearest spaceport? Jex tapped a few buttons on the console. There's one a few light years away. But listen, kid, if you're running from someone, space is not the place to hide. David frowned. What do you mean? Jex sighed. The people who were after your friend, they won't stop. If they want her back, they'll track her across the galaxy. Zara clenched her fists. I know. David exhaled. So we need to stay ahead of them. Jex snorted. You don't stay ahead of people like that. You make them stop chasing you. Zara looked at him. And how do we do that? Jex smirked. You make them afraid to come after you. David raised an eyebrow. How? Jex leaned forward. You hit first. Silence filled the cockpit. David glanced at Zara. Her expression was unreadable. Then slowly she nodded. He's right. David frowned. What are you thinking? Zara's violet eyes burned. I've been running my whole life. Maybe it's time to stop. The plan. Zara stood in front of a holographic map, studying it carefully. David sat beside her, arms crossed. You sure about this? Zara nodded. If I keep running, they'll keep coming. I need to end this. David sighed. All right. What's the plan? Zara tapped a glowing marker on the map. A hidden research facility. This is where they made me, she said. If we destroy their experiments, they'll have nothing left to protect. David whistled. We're talking about breaking into a high-security lab. Zara smirked. Scared. David grinned. Terrified. Jex chuckled. I like this plan. David rolled his eyes. Of course you do. Jex leaned forward. Look, kid, if you're really gonna do this, you need help. You need weapons. You need a crew. David exhaled. Know anyone? Jex smirked. I know a few. Recruiting the crew. David and Zira gathered a team. A former bounty hunter with a grudge. A hacker who could break into any system. A pilot with nothing to lose. They met in a smoky, dimly lit bar on a backwater planet. David stood up, addressing them. We're going after the people who did this to Zira. It's dangerous. It's probably suicidal. But if we pull it off. He smirked. They'll never chase her again. Silence. Then, the bounty hunter grinned. I'm in. The hacker shrugged. I like breaking into things. The pilot chuckled. I was getting bored anyway. Zira looked at David. For the first time, she didn't feel alone. She had a team. She had a mission. She had a reason to fight. David smiled at her. Let's end this. The final battle begins. The stolen ship roared to life, lifting off from the spaceport. David sat in the co-pilot's chair, grinning. Zira stood beside him, her violet eyes glowing with determination. For the first time, she wasn't running. She was going back. And this time, she was ready to fight. The reckoning. The stolen ship cut through the cold emptiness of space, heading straight for Zira's past. Inside, David stood with the crew around the holographic table. The map flickered, showing the hidden research facility, the place where Zira had been created, experimented on, and nearly destroyed. Zira's eyes were locked on the glowing structure. This is where it ends, she said. David crossed his arms. You sure about this? Zira turned to him. I don't have a choice. David smirked. You always have a choice. She hesitated. Then she exhaled. Then I choose to fight. Breaking in. The plan was simple. Step 1. Get past the outer defenses. Step 2. Infiltrate the main lab. Step 3. Destroy everything. Easy. David rolled his shoulders. This is gonna be a disaster. Jex grinned. That's the spirit. The hacker, a wiry woman named Lena, cracked her knuckles. Give me 10 minutes, and I'll shut down their security grid. The bounty hunter, Cade, loaded his rifle. If anyone gets in our way, I'll handle it. David checked his weapon. All right then, let's move. The infiltration. The ship descended into the planet's thick atmosphere, cutting through the stormy clouds. The facility loomed in the distance, a dark fortress built into the cliffs. Zira swallowed hard. She remembered this place. The cold metal floors. The endless tests. The fear. David touched her shoulder. You okay? Zira nodded. I will be. The ship landed just outside the security perimeter. Lena got to work, hacking into the system. Disabling cameras, opening external gates. Got it. David, Zira, and Cade slipped through the entrance. Inside, the halls were eerily quiet. Too quiet. David's gut twisted. Something's wrong. Then, the alarms blared. A robotic voice echoed through the facility. Intruders detected. Initiating lockdown. Zira's stomach dropped. They knew we were coming. The trap. The lights flickered, turning red. Doors slammed shut behind them. Then they appeared. The hunters. More than a dozen. Their black armor glinted under the flashing lights, their weapons humming with deadly energy. The lead hunter stepped forward. We have waited for you, Subject 0. Zira's fists clenched. I'm not your experiment anymore. David raised his gun. Well, this just got interesting. Cade smirked. Finally, some action. Then, the shooting started. The battle. David dove behind a console as energy blasts tore through the room. Cade returned fire, taking down 2 hunters with precise shots. Zira vanished, flickering in and out of visibility as she dodged attacks. David gritted his teeth. Zyra, you need to get to the main lab. She hesitated. David turned to her, eyes fierce. We'll hold them off. Go. Zyra's heart pounded. She hated leaving them behind. But she had to finish this. She turned and ran. The truth in the lab. Zyra sprinted through the corridors, her memories rushing back. She reached the core laboratory. The room was filled with tanks of liquid, each containing a figure. More of her, more experiments. Her breath caught. Some were still alive, half-conscious, trapped. Then, a voice. Zyra. She turned. A tall figure stepped from the shadows. A man, cold, calculating, familiar. Dr. Varric, the scientist who created her. Zyra's hands shook. I was hoping you'd return. Varric said, his voice smooth. You were always the strongest. Zyra's stomach churned. I wasn't your experiment. I was your prisoner. Varric sighed. You don't understand, Zyra. We weren't trying to hurt you. We were trying to save our people. Zyra's eyes burned. By turning us into weapons. Varric tilted his head. You have power. More than anyone. And now, you're running from it. What a waste. Zyra clenched her fists. I'm not running anymore. Varric smirked. Then show me what you've learned. The final fight. Varric pressed a button. The entire room shook. The tanks opened, and the other experiments stirred. Zyra stepped back. Varric's voice was calm. If you won't return willingly, I'll make sure you don't leave at all. The experiments opened their eyes, and they attacked. The last stand. Zyra dodged as one of them lunged, moving faster than anything she had ever seen. They were like her, only stronger, only deadlier. Zyra clenched her fists. She wouldn't let them win. She flickered out of visibility, confusing them. She moved, fast, striking one in the chest, sending him crashing into a console. Varric watched, amused. You've improved. Zyra ignored him. She needed to end this. Then, she saw it. A power core at the center of the lab. The heart of the facility. If she destroyed it, everything would fall apart. Zyra ran toward it. Varric's eyes widened. No. Zyra threw out her hands and unleashed everything. A wave of energy exploded outward, shaking the entire building. Varric was thrown backward, hitting the wall hard. The experiments collapsed, unconscious. The power core cracked. The room began to collapse. Zyra stood over Varric, breathing hard. He looked up at her, blood on his lip. You think this changes anything? Zyra stared at him. Then softly, she said, yes. And she walked away. Escape. David, Cade, and Lena fought their way to the exit. Then, the alarms changed. A self-destruct countdown. David's heart jumped. Oh, that can't be good. Then, Zyra appeared. David grinned. Took your time. She smirked. Had to settle a few things. The group ran. They reached the ship just as the facility erupted into flames. As they soared into the sky, Zyra watched the place that had haunted her for years crumble into dust. And for the first time, she felt free. A new beginning. On the ship, David leaned back. Well, that was insane. Zyra chuckled. Yeah. David turned to her. So, what now? Zyra smirked. Now, we decide where to go next. David grinned. Together. She nodded. Together. The stars stretched before them. And the adventure was just beginning.